Thank you and hello. My name is Daniel Stauffacher. I will be talking to you from a maybe different angle. My background is more diplomacy. I was an ambassador of Switzerland, and one of my prime tasks was to organize the World Summit on Information Society. I will talk about how innovation in the context of crisis management and peacekeeping can be useful and what the challenges are. But I was also asked to talk a little bit about the genesis of ICT for Peace and how we came about to this question. As I said, I was part of the organizing team of Switzerland for the World Summit on Information Society, which was the last summit of the UN Summit, to try to see how also developing countries be included in this emerging new information society. And as you remember, this summit was in two phases, and the first phase was in Geneva, 2003, and the second in 2005 in Tunis. And while the first summit was focusing on the question how we can include developing countries also in the information society and not be left behind. You know, today, of course, this was a threat that was less big than we know today. Then people came and said, but how about peace? And we're asking, if we want to achieve the Millennium Goals, we have to look at both development and peace. So what we did in the first instance, when we said, well, what do you mean by ICT for Peace? And therefore we carried out this first research project. I was still ambassador for Switzerland, to make the case and see whether this is not just a gadget, but something really. Based on this, we were then able, and you will see from my side, I talk a lot about policy and processes, we were then able to introduce a paragraph in the World Summit on Information Society in Tunis, where we asked the heads of state to recognize for the first time the value of ICTs in the conflict cycle, early warning, prevention, mediation, post-conflict reconstruction. As a follow-up to that, we were then thinking, you know, now we have this paragraph, what we're going to do about it, and we engaged with something that we think is very important, that the United Nations is always leading in most of the crises, in the conflict or humanitarian crisis, and we engaged with the Secretary General and then created a working group to develop a crisis information management strategy, which has this vision, basically how can we use information technology to have better information at our hands, to manage crisis, to make decisions, to have better information, improve situational awareness, and so forth. And we were building this strategy with all the members of the UN family, those who normally go into a mission, peacekeeping, humanitarians, all of them, and develop this strategy how we could better make use of information as a family, as a collective. And basically you will see here for the 4 pillars of, I'm not going to go into details, but first and foremost, very much important is, of course, the question of the data architecture. What information do we need to collect, share among each other? Second is technology. Here we know, of course, this is a fast-moving target. Then stakeholders that are involved. It's not only the UN, it's the host government, many organizations, and even the victims now are stakeholders in the information management context. And then capacity building. This strategy was then approved and became the strategy of the Secretary General. But at the same time, of course, and Nigel has already touched upon, we have seen witnessing a revolution taking place, first and foremost in Kenya, but then also really in a humanitarian context in Haiti, where some of these tools, like crowdsourcing, like the Ushahidis, but many other tools have emerged by a huge community of technology providers who understand themselves as humanitarians. We ourselves trying to promote among policymakers, because there was still a lot of work to be done to create awareness and improve decision makers to give necessary attention to information management. we're building these wikis. The first one was on Haiti, where we came to a list of about 110 open sources that were needed to manage a crisis better, and nobody took the effort to curate them in a list. So I think first example of open data. Now, what has changed since Haiti and since new media are available? We've seen there's so many new sources of information, even including witnesses. Victims and witnesses are producing data that have to be taken into account if you want to have a good, reliable information management system, a system for decision making and reporting. So the information breakdown is now different. In the old days, it was sort of the confidant of the Secretary General's representative going to the field and coming back with a report. Today, an information manager in a mission like peacekeeping has to be able to master all these sources in order to make an education recommendation for decisions. I spoke about this new community of actors which we have seen emerging in Haiti, but which we normally call the crisis mappers community or volunteer and technical communities. That is, I mean, something that the international organizations or governments who have an agency, who have a responsibility to help, have to engage with, and otherwise they will lack all the information. And we assisted ICT for Peace, assisted the UN to sort of formalize the relation with these new emerging communities, which we call now the digital humanitarian network, but an important provider of data in crises. The downside, I mean, these are great opportunities, but I think if we want to innovate, it's not that we innovate, but we use innovation responsibly. Of course, we have to look that we use this data responsibly, that we follow some minimum principles, that we apply the do no harm principle, and be very careful what we do with the data that we collect, that we protect the sources, that look at the data storage, data sharing protocols. And of course, this is a huge task because the more and more we see actors, private actors in this field emerging, but also we see now that more and more organizations, also private sector-led organizations, think about codes of conduct and guidelines to abide by sort of principles. Very important, the International Committee of Red Cross has also developed a set of standards when collecting, analyzing, using data information from victims or from other sources. So again, a very important positive step. We saw about the new technologies emerging. The drones are not only used by the military, drones are now more and more used for civilian operations, even for instance in Congo. And we see again a proliferation of drones for civilian humanitarian purposes. Again, there we are engaged with developing some standards that we keep some kind of an order. So these are certain points that I wanted to share with you with regard to what the ICT for Peace Foundation does in the field of crisis information management. Now, the second area that we are engaging, 2 minutes, yeah, is of course the notion that if we don't keep an open, free, safe, trustworthy web or cyberspace, we will lose all these tools which we can use for the benefit of humanity. And I'm talking about cybersecurity first and foremost. We have seen, of course, the threat from the criminal, from the terrorism, but increasingly also state behavior that poses a threat to the stability of the cyberspace. And there we are engaging with some emerging, finally, and we have calling for some negotiations at the global level to get some kind of a handle on these issues. The one is this process in New York by the governmental group of experts who is looking at responsible norms of state behavior. What do they mean in the international law context? What is required? And the second in the field is of looking at the possibilities of developing confidence-building measures. They are in the forefront, the negotiations at OECE, but also at the UN. We're looking how, and we, ICT for Peace Foundation, have been looking how we can support these negotiations by some sort of transposing some of the confidence-building measures that we know from the nuclear field or from the conventional arms field into the cyberspace. Extremely complex issues, and governments are still not ready to fully engage, especially P5 and so forth. So we see our role as a research, as an advocacy group that helps these processes. So with that, I thank you for your attention and be ready for questions and discussion. Thank you.
And that involves discussion, interaction. And the question I have for the panel is, what makes that discussion democratic process? We talked a little bit about democracy, about fair democracy, but that's a tough one. So I'd like to ask the panel to sort of give their views and to engage in the conversation about what is it that would make that discussion democratic.
I think what is really required is, I mean, it was touched upon, is literacy.
Yeah.
Literacy. I mean, what we, for our small work crisis management crisis, I mean, we are confronted with enormous amount of data. We're inundated, you know, we call it tsunami of data in often cases. And the capability to discern between the chaff and the wheat is just an enormous challenge. And when we look at staff, people that could perform these functions, there are very few. So that is something that we have to tackle. Otherwise, it remains non-democratic, or it's haphazard or selective.
Yeah. So we have three questions. Why should we bother when others aren't perhaps engaging? The voice of industry, how do you square it with the profit? And also, how do you widen that participation? How do you nuance the business stakeholder space?
I'm not sure if I answered the question, but with regard to CSR, I've become quite not cynic, but very cautious. I think if companies give money because it's part of their business, I think then we, for instance, you know, as an institution, would be very reluctant to accept, and I see that in universities in Switzerland as well. You know, big donations are looked upon. I think also that, for instance, in the financial sector, I mean, Swiss banks, and so they're very frightened about transparency, and ICT means transparency, and so there is still, you know, some. I think also education to do. Is still in senior management positions, people of a certain age who are not very close to these issues, and when the decision is made, can we help contribute? I tried with some insurance companies for our work. I find a lot of misunderstanding or reluctance or how to engage. I don't know if that helps, but I had some really sobering experiences with regard to the private sector.
Thank you so much. So we have three questions there. We have a question about how close are we to guidelines? Is that going to be something that is realisable? How do we break away from 17th century concepts that hold us back from a legal and economic perspective? And what advice do we have for people who are innovating with a bigger risk dimension than conventionally we're comfortable with? How do we deal with that, or are we shutting down our horizons?
Something that is sort of in my field of work. I don't know if it has to do with the 17th century of thinking, but it's in the field of work, let's say security, internet governance, and human rights. And this seems to be treated in three different communities and research. And of course we know intuitively they are all connected in a way. I mean, the more, as you know, we learn from Snowden and others how, you know, it's all, and somehow we also institutionally, international negotiations are in three different pillars. So this is something also that we have to maybe help rethinking this, how it's all connected and linked. Anyways, this is what I came to my mind with the question.